Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of all of living nature, I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. It's session number 450. That's how long we've been going as we've all been traversing the pandemic and gathering in a global commons, which is the purpose of Humanity Rising, to bring people together from all over the world to have discussions of gravity and import as the world events unfold, as we know they have over the last nearly 2 years now. Today, I want to bring in something that Claire passed on to me this morning. It really was exciting for me, as you know, from the trees and my welcome in the spirit of nature. There's been a researcher in the UK at one of the universities that has published research on fungi, on mushrooms. And he's determined that not only do mushrooms communicate, we all know this, the trees communicate, and they have extensive networks and chemical communications and so forth. But what's beginning to emerge is that these electrical impulses that the fungi are sending to one another are structured in discrete little units that have a remarkable similarity to the structure of human language. And so far, he's counted about 50 words that these mushrooms are using in their communication with one another. And they communicate on all kinds of things, from food to danger to an animal nearby. They're very aware, they're very alert, they're able to observe their external environment and communicate from what they're observing externally, internally, and then communicate that in discrete, almost intelligible chunks, intelligible by humans. It may well be that we speak as we do because the mushrooms, first, because they've been around for a whole lot longer, speak as they do. So just something to inspire your day about the fact that we humans are not separate from nature. We are nature. And in fact, our closest symbiotic relationship is with the trees. That's why I have this as a background. As the trees breathe out the oxygen, we breathe it in. When we breathe out the carbon dioxide, they breathe it in. So when you see a tree, recognize the tree as your dear relative because the tree knows you're here and probably would love to speak with you if we could access these ancient languages that I am sure in the end will be determined as shaping our own. So anyway, in that spirit of a living nature, I want to welcome all of you today. And before we dive into our program, let us just take a pause as we always do and just center yourself in your body. And if you can, just close your eyes just for a minute and attune yourself with your heart. And in a spirit of gratitude, thanksgiving for just being alive through your heart, communicate with the mushrooms and the trees for just a minute. Thank you, everyone. Now I would like to introduce our program. We're on day 4 of a 5-day program on humanity's reckoning with the wounds of race. It has been a marvelous, marvelous week, very deep and profound as we began on Monday, the first day, commemorating on April 4th, the anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. And then on the second day, we heard from Black youth, the emerging powerhouse of intelligence and kinetic energy that are shaping the next generation of African Americans in the United States. And then yesterday, we had a very powerful program with Black women on the question of soul and how the deep awareness that we have of soul informs our lives and informs our racial consciousness. It's a very, very powerful session. We're going to have a deeper dive into that down the trail. And today, we're going to go into what humanistic psychology has to say to these very deep issues that continue to afflict the human community around race. And I want to welcome Dr. Karoy Ferguson. He was the president or co-president for many, many years of the Association of Humanistic Psychology. So he knows a lot about this subject as a professor in these matters and as a clinical psychologist. And he's assembled a panel that's going to discourse on this very deep issue. So Cuff, thank you so much for everything that you've done, and I turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you all for joining us this morning or this afternoon or this evening. We're so happy to be with you in the spirit of collaboration and in the spirit of balance and in the spirit of trying to seek equity as we explore this notion of humanity's reckoning with its race-linked wounds. I wanted to bring into the conversation the whole subject of humanistic psychology, first because it's a kind of a psychology of the times. And each period of humanity has certain kinds of psychologies of the times. And I wanted to bring this into the conversation as one of many frameworks that one can use to help with this human condition that we find ourselves in. And so before we start, I just want to introduce our panelists first, and then there's a video clip that I'm going to show you that it's of me talking about the relevance of humanistic psychology and the Association for Humanistic Psychology. So can our panelists just turn on your videos while I introduce you, and so people can take a look at you. Okay. We have with us 3 folks who are very dear and to this subject, and we sort of are using this as an experience to reach across the pond, so to speak. Reaching across the pond with 2 organizations that are involved with humanistic psychology. It's the Association for Humanistic Psychology in the United States and the Association for Humanistic Psychology in Britain. And so these are representative voices. They will speak their own truth, but we're trying to experiment with the whole notion of collaboration and indeed what it really means to reach across the ponds and to reach across aisles, so to speak, to connect in this human experiment. So we have with us three people. Roxanne Hope. She is a very dynamic and motivated wellness professional. And after practicing psychotherapy in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire for a number of years, she's now in a farming community in Michigan. And she's now a practicing social worker in the public schools system there, and is doing wonderful work in that particular role. And then we have Bruce Southers, who is actually a former drug and alcohol counselor, now working in the legal industry. And he has a lot of experience leading and working with nonprofit organizations, including working in rural Africa with the Rural Africa Outreach Program there, and volunteers with the Donate Life and Life Center. So he's been has had a lifelong interest in humanistic psychology and currently lives in Kentucky. Okay. And then we have Mark Harrison, who is joining us from Britain. And he has been, for the first part of his life, first part of his working life, I should say, working largely in the computing area for large manufacturing companies. And then he started a second career in more humane endeavors that took him into doing some youth work. And then he parlayed that into beginning to explore person-centered counseling, got his master's degree, and then started working in a hospice, and spent a number of years doing that, and then transitioned into doing some private practice. So welcome, Mark. So what I'm going to do initially, before I have each person to sort of express their thoughts about humanistic psychology, there's a little video clip that I did. It was done a few years ago, pre-pandemic, where I was actually talking about the relevance of humanistic psychology for today's reality. Little did I know that it would have relevance for today. But I thought I would share it with you rather than having me to repeat today what I was saying. So, Georg, if you can cue that up, that would be very wonderful. Thanks, Mike, for creating this opportunity to talk about AHP and to talk about humanistic psychology. I think what I want to do is to share with you a little bit about why I think humanistic psychology is relevant today, and why AHP and how it came into being. What I wanted to share is that a lot of how I got involved with the association and with humanistic psychology had a lot to do with my background. I grew up in what's called the Segregated South, with all of what that means. Having to sit on the back of the bus, couldn't go into certain kind of restaurants, could not eat, couldn't go into certain movie theaters. In fact, I had to go into the side entrance to go to a movie theater, to go to the balcony. Little did people know those were the best seats, but that was the experience growing up. And then I got into psychology and was introduced to many different approaches to studying who we are and how we're wired up as human beings. So I was exposed to things like behavioral psychology, and I was exposed to Freudian, neo-Freudian approaches, and they left me wanting. With the behaviorist approach, it felt like the agency, the human beingness got left out. All I had to do was to give you a stimulus, and I can get you to respond in whatever way. So you had nothing to do with it. I give you a stimulus, and I get a certain response. I can condition you, and that works. But where's your agency? Who are you in that process? And then I was looking very deeply into the psychoanalytic approaches to things. And when I looked deeply at that, it's like, well, you know, by the age of 5, that's about it for you. And everything else got dumped into your unconscious. And heaven forbid if you looked into the unconscious, because all that yucky stuff is there, and you can't deal with it, because you got all these defenses. So wait a minute. I want to get deeper inside of me. So then I looked around and I tried to figure out, like, well, where does my experience growing up the way that I did, where does that fit in all of this? None of it talked to my experience. It didn't look at me as the whole human being. And then I stumbled across humanistic psychology. And it was the first time that there was a psychology that said, let's look at the dignity of the human experience. Let's look at the whole person, mind, body, spirit, emotions, the whole person and their environment that they're part of. Let's look at all of that in order to look at who you are, what you bring to the situation, what your experience is, what your uniqueness is. And I went, oh, here's something. And love yourself. Don't let anybody else tell you how to think. Your thoughts are yours. You create your own experiences. Let that matter. And so here was these people who were trying to put something together way back in the 1960s and said, well, let's put the human agency back into the picture. And so folks like Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, your love doctor.
My professor was Louis Scalia at USC. And Virginia Satir.
Virginia Satir. They were all kind of like floating around this idea here. And they were stumbling across, well, look, there's this thing about human potential. Each person can uniquely grow. Each person can be themselves. Each person has a unique way of expressing themselves. Let's value that. And we don't have to continue to look at what's wrong with people. We can look at what's working for people. And let's see if we can reinforce that. Wow. That's exciting. I don't have to focus all my energy on trying to fix anything. People can fix themselves if they're given the opportunity. And you provide the arenas and nudges. When I teach a course, and I say to most of the students that I teach, so you can boil all of psychologists down to whatever you begin to emphasize first. So there's a whole school of thought that emphasizes emotions. I start here with emotions, that should get us fixed. If I start with behavior, that should get us fixed. Or if I simply deal with cognitive stuff, that should get it. But it doesn't put it all together. And so humanistic psychology was one of those things that did that for me. And then there's this organization that flowed from all of that gave organized expression to it. That was the Association for Humanistic Psychology. So the psychology gave birth to this organization. The vision, what it really means to be human. Now, the relevance of all of that today is important.
It's a lot.
Very important. Because right now, it is very easy to do reductionistic thinking, mechanistic thinking, to reduce people to objects. To place everybody in certain kind of groups, and that's who you are. But the human being gets lost in all that. So our politicians will run around and saying, this group is this, and everybody that belongs to this group thinks that way. Where are you in that? Black folks think this way, white folks think this way, but where are you in that? And so for me, I wanted a space that said each person is important. Each person is unique. Each person has their own way of giving expression to their beingness. Each person can shine in their own way. And for me, that was the Association of Humanistic Psychology, and the psychology itself, humanistic psychology, was a way of trying to pull it together. Now, I'm not a diehard by any means. I know that there are many psychologists that work. And they work because the person who's doing it believes it. And that's where everything boils down to. If you believe something, you can probably get it to work. And what is a belief? A belief is nothing more than thoughts reinforced by emotion and imagination. That's all a belief is. Thoughts reinforced by emotion and imagination. So I want to invite people to dare to believe in yourself. Dare to believe in your possibility. Dare to believe in your potential. And if you do that, there's a home for you. And we call it the Association for Humanistic Psychology. Okay. So welcome to everybody, and I hope you find a way to join us and give expression to your own beingness. Now I've taken on I've been trying to do some writing. So if you go on the website, you'll see some of my writings up there. And I decided not to be shy about some of the things. So you'll see some writings up there I got about racism right now. Consciously dealing with racism. Don't shy away from it. Got to consciously deal with it. And you know that there's been stuff going on in the country today, the highest places, so to speak. But people forget that nobody actually has power over you except that which you give them. So you have your power, take it back. Use it the way you want to use it. And on that note, I'm going to stop because I could go on and on for days and days. All right, thank you. Okay. All right. So that was me trying to spot off about humanistic psychology and the meaning it has for me in my life. And I wanted to then bring in other folks here now to share your truth about how you got involved with humanistic psychology, what it means to you, and how you're trying to work with it in your life space. So I'm gonna let the lady go first, Roxanne. You wanna talk to us a little bit?
Oh, yeah. So I had this amazing professor at UMass Boston who introduced me to humanistic psychology by pointing out that I already believed in this. I just really hadn't heard of it before. And I used social media to bring people together with, humanity and love and kindness. And I also came into it. So I just finished my education last May 21st. So I grew up in a small town in Michigan, and was part of a matrix that I didn't even realize I was part of. And then raising two children with chronic illness, also serving in the military, I finally got to UMass Boston, where my whole life opened up. I also felt like there was something missing. I just wasn't clear on what it was. And figuring out, how I grew up, the matrix I was in, what was normal for me, what I never questioned, really needed to be questioned, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I'm continuing on that same path and journey today. And I really believe that teaching, starting at the elementary level, needs to change. I did not know how my brain functioned until, I came to university. I didn't understand, that emotions are just feelings in motion. I still use that line today. I didn't understand. I didn't understand how childhood trauma, like racism and experiences that you had, Cuff, affect us all as adults. And with all of this knowledge and understanding, I'm still learning and growing through it all. And I really appreciate humanistic psychology because it is subjective to the human. And it isn't giving anybody power. It's creating a base, like you said, to take your power back.
Hey, thank you so much, Roxanne. And if people haven't figured it out, Roxanne was one of my former students that she encountered at UMass Boston. And I was so appreciative for all of the stuff that she offered to our classes, and we've maintained contact since then. I want to bring in Bruce. Do you want to share any of your thoughts as opening remarks?
Absolutely. And just want to say thank you for the opportunity to be here today. So my first introduction to humanistic psychology came when I was an undergrad at the University of Kentucky back in the early 90s. Psychology major, so I needed to take an elective. And when I first saw humanistic psychology, I thought, okay, that sounds interesting. I'll give it a shot. The book, little did I know that the book that was our textbook and that class has literally started me on a lifelong interest in the field. While I'm not a professor and work in the field, I think I bring a viewpoint from maybe a non educational type of standpoint of just the realistic of humanistic psychology. So when I first picked up that book, it was Maps of the Mind by Charles Hamden Turner. Still have that book today. And really the main part that I back then focused in on was Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That resonated strongly with me, being able to kind of look at that hierarchy, kind of apply it to my own life. I grew up in central Kentucky, in a rural area. It was really not a very diverse area as far as race. It was very poor and rural. So I resonated at that time that the fact that I was actually in college, I was actually the first person to graduate from college in my family, in the history of my family, really kind of, showed to me that those principles within my own life of meeting those basic needs when I was younger and then moving on up that hierarchy. But I've had experiences in my life that I would call spiritual synchronicity. Cuff knows some story about my life where I had a passing of one of my sons and had several really powerful experiences related to, again, what I refer to as spiritual synchronicity, in which it really just connected me and others to the world in a way that I just had never really dreamed. So then I just reached out one day to join the AHP. And while I'd been part of that group for a few years, I realized that, I want to continue on with this, and asked to join the board. So I think I've been on the board for about 6 years now. And honestly, it's been the best experience of my life, being able to learn from Cuff, from all the other members in the group, as well as really just diving in and learning more about the field. So it's, again, just kind of a lifelong interest that's kind of brought me here. And really, again, just thank you for allowing me to come in and speak with you all today.
Thank you so much, Bruce. And then we reach across the pond. So Mark, you want to share some of your introductory thoughts with us?
Yeah, thanks, Cuff. I'll echo again. Yeah, thank you for having me here. And it's really great to sort of follow this through the week. I first came across humanistic psychology quite late. I came across a broader psychology back when I started my career in computing, having done a little bit of youth work, so that maybe just opened my eyes slightly. But when I went into computing, I was very orientated towards systems and organization and books on management. So it was all sort of Tom Peters and those sorts of books back then. And whilst I sort of found a lot in those books, a lot of it was about, as far as I'm concerned, how to exploit your workforce. I really felt it was how to get the best out of your workers, rather than how to be the best company for your workers. And so the little bit of youth work that I did back then set me with the idea of a second career and to do something more humane, more human orientated, which is my partner, Lindsay, is a neurophysio. So I thought I'll join her on that sort of a track. And so I chose to retrain into counselling. And I didn't know what branch of counselling to go for. It was a chance suggestion from a friend. And I read some books. There's a set of books called the In Action series, Person-Centered in Action, Integrative Counselling in Action, Psychodynamic in Action, and so on. So being a bookworm, I simply went to the library and read those books. And I opted for person-centeredness. And the reason I did that was because in my computing career, I'd had an interest in, like Roxanne mentioned, about how does the brain work? How does a person work? How can I build an artificial intelligence? How can I build a free will? And that was a sort of the theory element that brought me into counselling. But it also aligned me with some ideas from Carl Rogers. So the person-centered pulled me. CBT could have been a possibility, but I knew problem solving inside out. and I didn't hear any, it didn't catch me, because I thought, I know this, I can do that with my eyes shut. So I studied person-centered. The other thing about person-centered theory as well is it's quite minimalistic. There's a paper out there from Rogers in 57, which gives a straightforward 6 conditions model for doing therapy. I don't know, 10 pages long. And for me, from computing, where I was trying to optimize and minimize logic and complexity, this spoke to me as well. And that's become a basis for me theoretically. So in one part of my head, I'm a big theoretician, and I do a lot of thinking and a lot of chewing over. And that also takes me into looking at psychology within organizations and leadership. On the other side, though, as I decided in computing, I didn't fancy climbing management hierarchies. So I became what I would call a top techie. I just worked at being the best computer programmer I could be. I stayed at that level. And that's roughly where I stay in counseling. I focus mainly on meeting clients. I spend some time, in organizations, trustees, that sort of thing. But largely I try to spend time with clients and stay there. And that means I've not got a theory practice divide, but I almost move into that other mode of being there as a therapist to listen, do my best to understand, and allow people to reconnect with who they are, which is quite a lot of what you covered in your video, Cuff. That sort of sense of simply just find out who I am for myself and learn to believe in myself. And I believe basically our brains are rewired when people listen to us, when we actually manage to speak what we think.
Thank you, Mark. You've raised a couple of issues I want to explore a little bit more deeply with the three of you, just to see if we can do a deeper dive into the relevance of humanistic psychology. One of them has to do with this whole question of free will. The reason I want to explore that a little bit more deeply is because part of what we may be experiencing in this whole question of humanity's reckoning is, will people choose freely to reckon? Or whether or not it will be something that gets pushed aside by choice, because they may find it too challenging or too hard. So how do you think about the question of free will? Want to take that one on?
Yeah, this is Bruce. So free will, I've always thought of that as obviously a choice to do things that that a person wants to do. As it comes to the world, though, and I think we're seeing it in really horrifying fashion, is the will of one person can actually really have really traumatic effects on the rest of the world. So I think that at the same time, the free will of someone can also have very positive impacts on the world. So I think, though, that I'm not sure if this is answering the question there, Cuff, but I just wanted to kind of give my thoughts right off the top of my head, is that I choose in my own life to reach out and help others as opposed to stepping over others. And I think that, with my family as well, I've got almost 17-year-old and a 12-year-old. And, I've really spent a lot of my life teaching them that same philosophy, is that it's a choice for you to be able to be mean to someone or to be kind to someone. So that they're learning from the very beginning that that free will that they have, that they can certainly choose it and use it wisely, or use it for, maybe more more destructive purposes. And I think that just teaching them that they have it's up to them to be able to make that choice, and to do, to be kind and help others up, as opposed to, like I said, stepping over and even ignoring them, regardless of what the situation might be.
Okay. Thank you. Roxanne, you had some thoughts?
Oh, I do. So, so my tribe right now are the 11 to 14-year-olds. They're amazing. Free will is really hard to describe, and it's really hard to understand. And a lot of times kids feel that they don't have free will, that they have housing insecurity or they have food insecurity, and it makes it difficult for them. So what I focus on currently is teaching those kids how their brain works and where they are in their own brain development. And then I have them tell me when their brain is going to be fully mature. And it's usually like between 9 and 11 years from now. And so we work with what we have. And let's see, where was I going with this? I'm sorry. So, like what Bruce was saying, right now we're seeing one person who is invoking their will with a lot of money and power to hurt other people. What I know we are also going to see out of this is some of the most dynamic and beautiful humanity from the people in Ukraine. And so I'm trying to have the kids focus on that part of it, the resilience and the will of the people to defend their country, the will of their leader to reach out all over the world in every capacity possible, the communication that is involved, the higher level thinking that is involved in all of that, versus the other leader who is closing down communication and stepping over boundaries. So yeah, that's basically where I'm at right now with my tribe, and trying to educate them as much as possible that if they just pause, their emotions will dissipate and they will make objective decisions that will serve them better in the end.
Thank you. Thank you. Mark, do you have any thoughts about free will?
Just taking in what Bruce and Roxanne have said, and that idea of was it retribution you said, Cuff? A healing word, wasn't it?
It's reckoning.
Reckoning. And because at first I thought, I'm not sure, are we talking about Judgment Day? Are we talking about a reckoning with the past errors of humankind and, that sort of thing? For me, I see a spiritual basis for free will, but I see a potential for things going awry. And we get tied up in things, and people have, I'll call it, undue influence on each other. So when we make a decision, part of our decision making is that determined element of this, that, the other, the financial situations, etc., that Roxanne mentioned, but also the impact of maybe our parenting, our nurturing, etc. So from that point of view, there's a theoretical bent in me looking at how do we get back to a free will that's more spiritually driven, a bit like the soul contract that was talked about yesterday. From a practice point of view, my sense is of trying to give people, my clients, the space where they can explore whatever they need to explore in trying to undo some of the undue impact of others, to try and undo some of the wounds from wherever they've come, and to give them that space to do it in whatever way they choose to do it, which is one thing I really value about the humanistic psychology, is that not only am I not outcome orientated in terms of like a medicalized model being imposed, but I'm also not process fixed either. I'm quite happy to work fully unstructured to allow each person to explore in whatever way works best for them. And I feel that's really important, because that believing in yourself that you mentioned in the video there, for me, it's about that person being able to hear themselves and to decide, who am I really? What do I believe of myself? And to find their own empowerment that way.
It's very powerful in a way. I'm reminded actually of a couple of things that's, this is a little self-serving here, in the book that I produced called Evolving the Human Race Game, but it's contained in there actually is a discussion of free will, but I call it there's a forceful will and then there's a wise will. And what Roxanne has been alluding to, is that forceful will, that's operationalizing itself now in Ukraine with lots of different deleterious effects. And the wise will pauses before it does certain kinds of actions, and goes into that deeper space, that spiritual space that Mark, you were talking about, and ask, what kind of impact will this have? If I choose to do something, how is that connected to other things around me? And can I then choose wisely so that both myself and the other person can benefit? When that wisdom isn't used, then for whatever reasons, one may fall prey to that forceful will. You do what I tell you to do, kind of thing. Okay. Well, thank you for your thoughts about that. There are some other things that I wanted to see if we can get a little bit of deeper understanding from all of you. You've alluded to some principles of humanistic psychology. Anybody want to take a crack at what some of those principles are? Mark, you want to take a crack at that?
Okay. In a nutshell, it's roughly what you've just said. It's take care. Be careful to listen and understand accurately, but also be careful with your words and the impact they may have on others. I feel that's what it's all about. That we're all human and we are both physically and psychologically vulnerable. We can be hit by somebody, both physically and psychologically, and that can have undue impact, which then affects how we decide in the future. So they're the sorts of wounds that happen that have been discussed through the week even. And for me, I believe that the basis of humanistic psychology is that by showing respect and love, we can allow somebody to reconnect with who they really are, more of that sort of spiritual being. That for me is the basis of it. That's why I stay largely with the Carl Rogers sort of 6 conditions model as a very concise theory, because everything else for me is bells and whistles on top. That's not to sort of dismiss it altogether, but for me, it's like 80% of my job, 90% of my job is listening and trying to understand and helping people to understand for themselves.
Okay. Any other thoughts that people have around that? Some of the principles?
Yeah, so, I think certainly what Mark said was with respect. I also feel like empathy is something that is really needed. Being able to look from someone else's eyes, or walk through, life in someone else's shoes, being able to kind of put yourself in their position. I think that it's very easy these days to not do that, but so we really have to make a conscious free will choice, if you will, to be able to do that and see the perspective of others, and really how those life experiences that person has really caused or shaped them to be the person that they are. And I also think self-awareness is really important. Being able to be self-aware of where you are, especially in stressful moments, I think is really vital, because we're emotional beings. We react to things, and a lot of times really kind of forget and not be self-aware. So I think that is a principle that I certainly try to and fail, and keep trying and failing to keep making sure that I'm self-aware in moments, especially with others around me, so that I really practice more respect and empathy.
Okay. Thank you for those thoughts. Self-awareness. Easy words to say, difficult to do. Roxanne, you have any thoughts?
I'll just echo both Mark and Bruce with the emphasis on empathy and compassion. And currently, those major tenets of humanistic psychology are having a huge impact on my work. I have recognized, working with students and community, that we've all been through a collective trauma, experienced through many different ways with this pandemic. And listening to each family that I work with and each student, I'm understanding that this has affected them in many different ways. And so the tenet of being subjected to the individual and the active listening and understanding what is going on from that person's perspective is huge right now.
Thank you. I wanted to, there's a train that goes through a lot of the comments that comes out as a commonality. And one of them has to do with the issue of listening, active listening, which is a really interesting part of what's required in order to really engage in empathy, engage in respect, engage in really seeing the human potential within each of us and the other. So that active listening, while it's again easy to say, difficult sometimes to be. In other words, it's I do a little thing sometimes in my classes about actually, Roxanne, you may remember some of this, about the poor listening habits, where there's about 16 of them, but sometimes we engage, for example, in rehearsing things before we've actually heard the person, like how we are going to respond. So we really don't hear the entire message that somebody's communicating, or we may listen for points of disagreement, things of that nature. And the kind of thing that humanistic psychology is suggesting is minimize those kinds of poor listening habits, to really be present when you're with someone. to really be present in the moment so you can get the full experience of what it really means to be with that other person. And so, Mark, I'm sure in your therapy work, it's about being present with the person, allowing them to be where they happen to be, and without judging where they happen to be. And again, those are easy things to say, but very difficult to allow oneself to be in that kind of space, particularly when you're dealing with wounds and traumas and all kinds of things that are keeping people from, we use Maslow's term, self-actualizing. By the way, when I speak of self-actualizing, I want to turn to the subject around that, and I want to ask each of you: have you ever encountered anybody who you think is self-actualized? That's an interesting one, huh? Anybody want to take that one on?
That's an interesting question. Yeah. I honestly, I don't know if I have. I probably have, but I may not have known it. But I certainly think that it's certainly possible. But I know that, at least in my own experience, it's just a continual. It's on a continuum towards the self-actualization. It's not. It's really more of the journey than it is getting to the summit, I guess, so to speak. So, and knowing that we're not perfect, I'm not perfect, is always a step back, move up kind of process in our lives. So, if there are, I think that's great, but I certainly couldn't say that yes, I'd say this person has met that definition.
That may be a trick question in the sense that we're all in process.
Exactly.
I'm trying to, but I wanted to put it out there to see if in your experience, if you ever encountered anyone who, in your mind, you would say, "Oh, that's a self-actualized person." So.
I was going to say you, Cuff, but I didn't know if they would think said that on purpose, since
we're all involved in our own growth. So yeah, it's Mark. You wanted to say something?
I'm fully with Bruce on the idea of it being, and what you've already said about a trick question, that this is a process rather than an end point. And I know Rogers used that term, fully functioning person, as sort of the idea of an end point, and yet still a person in process, always, that sort of idea. For myself, I happened to watch a film the other week called Mission Joy, which was a meeting between the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, and them talking very friendly with themselves, with a deep spirituality. And in one way, I can feel like there's a lot of actualization here in terms of being in touch with our spiritual side. I think that's a really important aspect of it. And yet both men are both still very engaged with the world, very engaged in being with others and offering themselves to others, as I see it. That sort of sacrifice of service, I think, as they talk about it there, which is a bit like a leadership thing. So for me, that's sort of a person who can be that deeply in touch with their spiritual side and yet still be fully engaged in the world, comes as close as I can think.
Beautiful, beautiful. Those are very wonderful examples of folks who are really engaged with the experience of what it really means to be human in all of its totality. That is the spiritual part, the physical part, and the mental part, which are so important for feeling that sense of integration as we are in process of continuing to become. And Rogers, Maslow's book on becoming human is an important kind of contribution to that process. All right, let me see if we can talk a little bit about the whole notion of if we were to enlarge our discussion having to do with societal concerns and the whole notion of what it might mean and how would a more humane societies look. What comes to your mind about how would more humane societies actually look if we were really being humane to one another?
Well, if the group doesn't mind if I go, I think that I've given this a lot of thought in my life, and I really think that dehumanization is probably the biggest risk, in my opinion, to the stability of the world today. And it crosses, that we've created a litany of words to describe others that are different from us, whether it's race, ethnicity, social status, language, all those things that we used to really categorize and thus dehumanize those groups of people in subtle and really not very subtle ways. So, I mean, I think a society of which, we are viewing others that are different as really the same, because, I mean, I could go through and list, ways that people are different, but in reality, I guarantee that there's more things that they're the same than different. So I think that a couple factors. So one, really dehumanizing people and just placing others in categories of people, or even using words that are using terms that are really, subhuman. We've all heard these kind of horrible things people have said. So I think that a more humane society is eliminating that from our vocabulary, eliminating it so that we don't even hear it and think it. I know that's not an easy task, but I mean, that's where I see is that the viewpoint of looking at others as lower and thus dehumanizing is a huge issue in the world today. And I think that by working towards a more humane society where we're looking at our similarities than our differences is really a great way to start.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Mark is shaking your head. You want to add on to anything?
I'm nodding along there, but I noticed, Roxanne, you maybe moved to speak.
Oh,
Okay.
I completely agree with you, Bruce. I've thought about this a lot, and I kind of go in circles sometimes. It seems like, especially in the United States, we're very polarized right now. But my basic thoughts come to the premise of celebrating our diversity is part of humanity, appreciating all of the voices at the table, understanding we gain nothing by subjugating people. I also believe that it's time for a reckoning of looking over our large systems, how they were created, who they were created to serve, and making some changes, understanding the difference between equity and equal, starting in kindergarten. So I think there's a long way we have to go, but I also believe that, especially currently, there is a lot of bad messaging, and messaging that is inclusive of everyone is so important. For example, not to say you corporations are all bad, but figure out what the messaging needs to be for the corporate buy-in, what the messaging needs to be for the public buy-in. And usually messaging that is focused on humanity, love, and kindness, and the strengths that are in all of us tends to be the better messaging. And I'm not sure why we don't do that all the time.
Interesting. All right. I want to follow up a little bit with you before I ask Mark to say something. You mentioning the whole notion of equality and equity, and there's a profound difference. For me, sometimes it feels as if sometimes we get caught up in an equation that, and the equation is basically one that says equality equals sameness. And so when we get caught up in that equation, the diversity that you're speaking of sometimes gets lost. So differences then get reframed as somehow negative. And then the question then is what's another equation that might help us to reframe how we think about things? And that equation might be something like differences equal uniqueness. And then when we begin to appreciate the uniqueness of each person, we're actually appreciating all of the differences and diversity. Something to ponder. Anyway, Mark, did you have any kind of comment you want to add?
If I can add, I think full agreement with what Bruce and Roxanne have shared there. And when Roxanne mentioned of kindergarten, there's for me, in that idea of how might a more humane society look, there's a question of schooling. And when I was at school, it was a terrible experience for me. I was very bullied. I found it an awful experience. When I went into youth work, and later on, I actually tried teaching as a career, very, very briefly, about 3 months I survived in a school, to find it was still as bad as back when I was at school. And then I read Carl Rogers' Freedom to Learn. And in the opening pages, in fact, may I just share for a minute this? He talks about observing a classroom. And he says how there's all the students there, I think they're all about 10 years old, that sort of age, engaged in different activities. And so for me, that's the first thing. They're not all being forced to do the same thing at the same time. There's a choice. Each student's got a choice. And I think that's a big point. And Rogers notes that the teacher makes a call to everybody, say, hey, we've got a bit of a problem. You know, one group's being a bit too noisy and we need to resolve that problem. Who wants to be involved in resolving that problem? So it's that question and willingness to involve everybody. And Rogers notes that. And the response is actually that very few of the class do want to be involved, but definitely the group that are being too noisy do. But everybody else is sort of quite happy to leave it to the teacher. And for me, that's something about a trusting responsibility being passed. It's not about a bystander apathy. It's more of I trust the people who will solve that problem. I trust my fellow students, my teacher. And I think that's a really good show there. And from there, they move through that. There's something that's not in that book or not in that little story, which is that I would guess that both Rogers and the teacher were also ready to facilitate if there was dissent. You know, if the group had said, I'm sorry, that's your problem. We're doing okay here. I'm sorry we're being a bit noisy, but we're learning well, you know. And if there had been a level of dissent over what is a problem or not, I think both Rogers and the teacher would have been able to facilitate and work with that dissent and find something that works for all. And so I think for me, that little sort of image just captures the whole idea of us all working together for the good of all.
Excellent.
And I realize maybe there I'm saying little about differences and celebrating difference and diversity, but I really do believe very strongly in that celebration of difference and diversity. So I'm going to add that there, and I can see that diversity hopefully within that classroom. Yeah.
Right. So it's kind of like not denying any aspect of who you presently are, and celebrating all of that. I know that Jim has mentioned that he has some limited time, and I wanted to bring him back in, not right now, but I wanted to, in about a couple of minutes, bring him in. But I wanted to, I posed you to the three of you a pre-question to ponder. So I wanted to see how you responded to it, and had to do with the whole idea of, if you were to be a consultant or a therapist to a dictator or an authoritarian head of state, how might you work with that person using a humanistic approach? There's a challenging question. Did you give any thought to that one?
So much thought.
Okay.
It was a really challenging question. And I couldn't come up with a good enough answer, except for, when I really thought about it, I thought, okay, they would have to do a 2-hour yoga practice with me before anybody said a word. And then I would be actively listening.
Okay. Well, it might break through. Might make some breakthroughs there. I know you're a wonderful yoga teacher. So. All right. Any thoughts, Bruce, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I just think as difficult as it would be, I think kind of going back to that principles of humanistic psychology that I talked a little bit earlier, we've heard about, is empathy, because and really also in the humane society is the dehumanization, because when someone that is a brutal dictator, they look at others as less than them. They don't look at them on the same level. They don't certainly even have any empathy. So I think that maybe a group approach on how we would go about tackling it would be best. But I think focusing in on how to help that person get more and really feel more empathy towards others. But it certainly would be a tall task, but I think that needed to be done, because as leader of a country or a dictator or authoritarian can really create a lot of pain for people.
Okay. So surround that person with a lot of folks who have a lot of empathy and do some modeling for him.
Do some modeling.
Okay. How about you, Mark? You had any thoughts about that?
I had the luxury of a largely free day today to think about this one. And given what's already been said, I'll go with my theory head rather than my practice head on this one. So the 6 conditions for me bring in the empathy, the non-judgmentalism. There's another condition there, which is that the client is motivated to engage, that this dictator is maybe motivated to engage with me. I'm not quite sure that's going to start. We're off the starting blocks. But let's say that it's, part of my job sometimes is to try and develop engagement. So as I try and rework the idea of being a therapist to being a consultant to a dictator, my whole orientation is towards how is this person going to become a more humane person? If they have no empathy, I don't fully believe that's a non-starter. I believe that somewhere is some spiritual connection, even in the worst of people, if I can put it that way, that can be tapped to, and from there can maybe unfold or come forth a greater empathy. So for me, in being with that person, it's that question of, can we find that motivation? And that means, what are they actually motivated to do then? So they might be motivated to try and find change in themselves. Maybe they're aware, I think I've got an empathy problem. Not sure if that's going to be the case. But they also might want me there because, like, sometimes psychology gets misused in power systems to manipulate people, and they want to improve their systems of manipulation or wielding power. And for me, all I can offer would take it towards being a more humane system, I would hope. So for me, it falls onto that side of things. And then, that carries on into the idea of increasing their reign of power or extending it. But I feel that's maybe enough for now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts around that. It is one of the things that's undergirding a lot of what may be manifesting itself in the world today, which is how do we help those who are in leadership roles to find that empathy, to find that connectedness, to find that way of viewing themselves as connected to a greater whole than what they may be engaged in, and to really help provide some opportunities for them to really examine what are the things that are at play for them, and why they do what they do, why they make the choices that they make. Which I'm reminded of a piece that I wrote some years ago having to do with the war in Iraq, and I was exploring, it was called Follow the Leader, Fear and Projection as the Root Causes of the War in Iraq. And I was looking very closely at Bush and Saddam Hussein, and what about their experiences that actually moved them to create the war. Found actually a lot of similarities that I didn't expect to find, but for different reasons. They were involved with a similar space, doing a lot of fear stuff and projection in that process, and had someone sat down, so to speak, and allowed them to actually look at one another with empathy, that war may not have occurred, but that's my idealism speaking. Okay. Mindful of time, I want to bring Jim back in for any comments or words that you may have at this point.
Oh boy, what another rich session, Cuff. You asked some very deep questions, and particularly on the one on free will. And as we discussed before, Mark, I'd like to get you back for a deeper dive on that, because I think that's a seminal question. And Cuff, with your question also about, do we know anybody who's actually self-actualized, kind of is perplexing. And I think my mind jumped to Desmond Tutu and His Holiness the Dalai Lama for the reasons that you all stated. They went through the fires of life, external, internal, and as a result of that, became actualized through, as it says in the book of Hebrews about Jesus, that he learned obedience through what he suffered. And I think there's deep wisdom in that. And I would add Martin Luther King, that clip that you played, Cuff, of one of his last speeches. He says, I've been to the mountaintop, and you could feel that he had been to the other side. And because he'd been to the other side, there was nothing that anybody was going to do to him on this side that was going to in any way impact the actualization that had been burning within him for many years. If you contrast that with, say, Malcolm X, Malcolm X didn't have that energy at the end. He was still in the consternation of the struggles and so forth. I just use that as a quick analogy, not to negate Malcolm, but to say that I think Martin Luther King, before he was taken, had reached that apogee moment of self-actualization. And I think I also thought of Mother Teresa, who I had the pleasure of meeting a couple times, and she just radiated goodness and love and compassion it seemed to me, in every fiber of her being. And I think that's important, that we be able to at least count somebody, in our lives. Even I thought of my mother. My mother was just a beautiful human being. So it doesn't have to be one of the great ones, the celebrities or the ones that have a lot of press. It can be someone that we know, like a Sufi master or a Taoist sage that lives, as a carpet maker or a carpenter in an obscure place in the world without any recognition or notoriety. So the self-actualization, I would just add, isn't something that needs necessarily to be publicly recognized. I think it's often hidden from view. You think of the Jewish notion of the 36 just men, that at any time in the world, God won't destroy it if there's at least 36 of us who are fundamentally just. And so then just finally, I just want to acknowledge humanistic psychology, because I agree with what you all have said, that it's one of the few psychological schools, I think, that tries to encompass the totality of what it means to be human. And I think that was the great contribution of Maslow and Rogers, with the hierarchy of being, and with, Stan Groff and the different ones, trying to think of all the different aspects that go into making us human. And I just wanted to make one point. I think that's particularly poignant today, at a moment in history where the external reality is shaping our humanity in fundamentally publicly observable ways. Look at the pandemic. 2 years into the pandemic, every single indicator of human dis-ease is going off the charts. And then on top of that, you get the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All of us are stressed in ways we've probably never been publicly stressed before. And the results of that external, internal interactivity is affecting our psyches. And that's one reason why on Humanity Rising every day, we start with a heart coherence just for a minute. Because the research shows, even if you take 60 seconds and just commune with your heart, you release all kinds of hormones and all kinds of good things kind of happen. So I just wanted to acknowledge all of you, the brilliance of humanistic psychology. And I think given the complexity of the world situation right now, humanistic psychology, based ultimately, I think, Bruce, on what you were indicating on empathy, if we could just activate more empathy with each other and with the larger ecosystem. You know, in the primary school where your new playground, as you said, your new tribe, Roxanne. You know, just empathy is such a quality of being that is so rare in a highly stressed environment, but so fundamental if we're going to keep our coherence sufficient to be able to navigate an increasingly hyper-complex and turbulent external reality with some dignity and with some capacity to enable compassion to flow through us. And that's the model, again, of Desmond Tutu and His Holiness. No matter what was going on outside, they always could access their compassion. And I think there's something in that equation that is what actualization, at least for me, represents. And when we see it embodied, you know, we're inspired. So I really want to thank you for this session. And it may be that down the trail, we should have a deeper dive into how humanistic psychology can serve the greater good, given the current global crisis in which we find ourselves. So I'm deeply grateful and want to thank you for everything that you're doing. So that brings us to a close, everyone. Cuff, I acknowledge once again on day 4 of 5, and tomorrow Cuff will be bringing our week-long program on humanity's reckoning with the wounds of racism to a close. So I want to just acknowledge that and look forward to your 5th and final session tomorrow. So that'll do it, everyone. I invite everybody to our after session chat group. You'll see the link in the chat box, and we'll see everybody again tomorrow, same time, same station here on Humanity Rising. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.
Well,
Brilliant session. Brilliant session. Great questions, Cuff. Great questions. Bye, everyone.
bye-bye. Thanks, folks.
Thank you again. Thanks for letting me be a part of this.
Thanks so much, Mark, Bruce, Roxanne. Really
Take
appreciate
care.
it.
Thank you. Really great experience. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.
All right. Take care.